So today I'm going to talk about the place of marriage in the new relationships and sex education guidance, which is going to be starting in our schools. Now, before I get into the meat of the topic, I just want to say something, which is that I'm going to be talking quite a lot about LGBT ideology, and I want to make it clear that for me, LGBT ideology is something which is separate from gay and lesbian people. So you've got gay and lesbian people who are supportive of LGBT ideology, but you've got a lot of straight people who are supportive of it. And you've got a lot of gay people who are not supportive of LGBT ideology. So I just want to make that point, that this ideology is separate from gay people. Okay, now in terms of the place of marriage in the RSE curriculum, one of the first points I want to make is that if you look at the data of young people's views on marriage, the Centre for Social Justice did some research on this before they wrote their contribution for the consultation. And almost, I think for a high proportion of young people, long-lasting relationships are incredibly important. So long-lasting relationships are really important, in fact more important than career. Marriage is incredibly important. And then there was also another organisation did a report called Love, Lust and Loneliness, and I'm going to this was just among 16 to 19-year-old boys, and I thought the findings from this were really interesting as well. So we have 87% of these young men want to end up in a long-term relationship, 93% expect to get married at some point, 86% to have children, and they also attached a great deal of value to their own parents' marriage and to their grandparents' marriage. So marriage is something which is very important to our young people. Now, before the government did their report, they also did a consultation, and I think about 3/4 of the respondents were parents. And it was very clear from the parents' responses that they wanted their children to learn about marriage. They thought marriage was an important thing for the RSE curriculum to include. And when they said marriage, they meant marriage between men and women. This was clear. And they also felt that there wasn't enough emphasis on marriage. The reason why they don't seem to have much about marriage is because while 3/4 of the people who were consulted were parents, a lot of organisations who produce sex and relationship material also filled in the consultations. And I checked a number of these. I think I checked the NSPCC, Brooke, Coram Foundation, Sex Education Forum, and there was almost absolutely no mention of marriage or family in any of their documents which they submitted to the government. So what the government did is that it listened to what the sex education providers thought we should be teaching our children, and they paid very little attention to what parents thought we should be teaching our children. So then I started looking at the place of marriage in the resources which have been produced as a result of this guidance. And what you find is there's almost nothing on marriage. So there'll be things which, for example, are telling you the difference between civil partnership and marriage, or that you can have gay marriage. And then there's this other slide here, for example, this tells you, it says sort the words and images into reasons people choose to marry or form a civil partnership. And I mean, this is just such a superficial view of marriage. And then I was looking at I think it's the PSHE, and yeah, they made the legal distinctions, and then they had a whole exercise on this distinctions between forced and arranged marriage, which is completely irrelevant to us growing up in this society. That affects a tiny minority of people, and yet that was a whole unit in our RSE thing, although it affects so very few young people. And then I did word searches in our various relationships and sex education providers on the word marriage, and it would come up with things like many abortions are performed by married people. I mean, many married people have abortions, or they'd say something like when people come out of a marriage they need to know about sexually transmitted diseases. I could find nothing at all positive about marriage. in the relationships and sex education material. But what you do find instead, well, we learn nothing about marriage throughout the whole curriculum, and embedded in all the different topics, as well as throughout the relationships and sex education curriculum, but throughout all the topics, is the place of gay marriage. So, for example, you'll find that teachers are told, you know, if you're doing a sum, make sure that your sum is about, you know, includes gay couples. So you'll have, you know, how many biscuits were there at, you know, how many gifts were there at, you know, Sarah's and Katie's wedding, or they'll say, you know, Pete was planning a honeymoon for his dad's, and then you'll also have things like there's a whole range of books which are about gay marriage. There's Prince Henry, and there's King and King. And by the way, King and King had a whole theatre production made. You know, the Proud Trust was obviously given a lot of money by the government to do this theatre production of this gay marriage. So when it comes to gay marriage, suddenly marriage is everywhere. And it's also funny because in the past, we weren't really allowed to talk about mothers and fathers. So, for example, this is how to transform your school into an LGBT-friendly place. So this would say, for example, you know, if your LGBT carer walks through the door and asks for a registration form, does it ask for mother's name or father's name? Or does it simply say parent 1 and parent 2, or even caregiver 1, 2 and 3. So when it comes to heterosexual relationships, parents, mothers and fathers are not part of the picture. But when it comes to gay relationships, then we hear all about marriage and gay marriage and gay relationships and so on. The argument that I want to make here is that if it was simply a case of, you know, we've got marriage and parenthood and family, and heterosexuals want a slice of that cake, and they're just going, gay people want a slice of that cake, and they're going to, they want to have marriage like us and families like us, and they're going to model things a lot in the same way as they're already done, I probably wouldn't be here doing the video. But what's actually happening is that it's not just, is that as gay people are getting married, and as this and having children and all the rest of it, what is happening is that there is a whole new model of marriage and parenthood and sexuality which is being created, and that this is what's being taught to our children. So there's a whole new way of doing things. It's that normal sort of heterosexual relationships are now being modelled along homosexual lines. And what I want to do is outline some of the ways in which this is happening. So, first up, one of the things which is which goes throughout the sort of teaching children about LGBT relationships in primary school is that these are not sexual relationships, and this is very important, because they know that if they were sexual relationships, you know, parents would get upset about this, which would all be fine. But what's happening is that we're actually creating a model of marriage to children which actually looks more like a contract between best friends, and I think that this is this is really quite confusing for young children. It's quite interesting because actually gay marriage is different. Gay marriage does not involve sexual consummation. You don't have to. So in a sense, gay marriage is simply a contract between two people. But by actually communicating this to our children through things like Prince Henry and other books, children will, I think, get quite a confused idea of what marriage is about, because actually it should be about so much more than a contract between two friends. But there are other ways in which I think that gay marriage changes very fundamentally how we understand marriage, because marriage is something that's been around for thousands of years and across many different continents. It's taken many different forms, but a really definitive feature of marriage is that it does actually, is the idea that there will be children. And we all know that, of course, marriages are not necessarily procreative. Many people can't have children, older people get married, and so on. But the idea of reproduction adds a real symbolic weighting to marriage, and also it means that marriage is essentially also a social contract, because through children we connect past generations with future generations. Marriage is about, it's to do with the wider society as well as the two individuals. And I think there are also other meanings of marriage which I think are important. For example, the idea of difference, you know, two different, you know, two halves coming together to make a whole. I think marriage has a lot of symbolic weightings which really disappear when you focus on gay marriage, because as we know, gay people can't procreate. They can't create their own children, and so that fruitfulness, that concept of marriage as being something fruitful, disappears, and also the whole social dimension of marriage disappears, and marriage becomes much more focused in on the relationship between the two individuals. I think it is true to say that probably for the past 100 years or maybe longer, marriage has increasingly sort of homed in on the two individuals and perhaps been seen less as a social thing than it is in some countries. But I think this is to the detriment of marriage. I don't think this is helpful to marriage, that it's reduced to being, you know, the love story between two people. I think that traditionally marriage means a whole lot more, and that with gay marriage we're losing sight of this. So but there are many other things. I think it's quite interesting, by the way, in that context, that we actually have relationships and sex education, because what we've done is separate out relationships and sex from each other, and these are two things which should really be embedded together. But what we've also done with gay marriage is taken procreation away from parenthood, and I think this fundamentally alters the meaning of being a parent. I think that if you're a small child, when you first cotton on to the fact that your parents have done something to produce you, this kind of gives parents, in a way, sort of more magic and authority. So I think that the symbolic, that the fact that parents create children is of great symbolic significance for our understanding of parenthood. But it's also marriage, mother and father, are really important for understanding, male and female are really important for understanding our concepts of mother and father. What's being taught in our schools is that, so we will learn that, and you can see this, in fact I might just put a slide in, but being a parent is a sort of, there's a list of duties, a list of jobs that go along with being a parent, but actually if you look at mother and father, these mean so much more, you know, whether you're talking about psychology or literature, or just our way of understanding the world. Because mothers give birth to children, we have terms like mother nature. Mother is sort of creator of new life. And fathers, if we think about fathers, even though we've had however many years of, you know, feminist ideology, fathers still play an incredibly important protective and providing role. If you look at the data on it, fathers will, they increase their income when they when they have a partner, they'll increase their income. When they get married, their income goes up again. When they have their children in that relationship, their income goes up yet again. And also, I read something quite interesting, which is that one of the reasons that fathers are so often the disciplinarians is because they're protecting the mother from the bad behaviour of her children. And I think that this idea of providing and protecting is and the idea of nurturing, these are really important to these concepts. But if you have a man who's married to another man, you're not going to have the notion of providing and protecting, because the other man won't need, he doesn't give birth, he's not out of action for any length of time, he doesn't need, he's just as, I mean, I'm not, women are just as capable, but I think that whole meaning of mother and father really gets knocked on the head. And I also want to, and what I want to say is that the way that relationships and sex education is teaching our children, if it was simply a case of sometimes two women get together and form a family, but it's not that, because if you look at the materials, the children are being taught to valorize these different permutations of relationships. So this was from one of them, and you give it first the child draws an imaginary family or an animal family, and then they have to draw a family which is different to their own family. So if you've got two brothers, your imaginary family shouldn't consist of two brothers, but perhaps a brother and a stepbrother. And then there are other exercises where children are presented with a whole range of families: gay, lesbian, single parent, blended, adopted, foster family. And what I call a normal family, and I don't really, the sort of traditional family, is just presented as one of very many options. And I think that is, in a sense, devaluing it. And again, you see, here's another exercise here, diversity role models, and it tells children build a family images, and it tells children to just create their own families. And this is what children are being taught. Children are being taught that families are just sort of groups of people that come together and bring up children. And actually, if that's what families became, it would be absolutely disastrous for children, because biology plays a really important role. And although, and when I say this, for example, if you look at the data on step parents, children who grow up with step parents are loads more vulnerable than children who grow up with their own biological family. And that doesn't mean that if you don't have biological relatives, biological parents, of course they can compensate and for the fact that they're not biological, and they can compensate, they can completely make up for this. But we need to recognise the difference between biological and that a biological family actually does have value. I don't think it's helpful to pretend that it's just completely insignificant. It's quite interesting, because I heard the other day that one of the most popular sorts of websites are those genealogical websites where you can trace your ancestors. People really, they like knowing who their sort of biological ancestors are. And if you are a parent with children, it's always fascinating seeing the genetic similarities and differences between them and their parents. So children are being taught, in order to make people who don't have more conventional families, they're being taught that all families are absolutely equal. But this isn't really true. There are some forms of family which work better than others, and that we should strive for. And I'm speaking as someone who's never had that, but I still recognise that there are certain ideal forms, and it's good to strive for them, and if you don't achieve them, to sort of compensate for the losses, but instead children are being taught that everything is absolutely equal. And I will just, before I go on, point out a real contradiction here, because this is all about tolerating difference, but what's actually being done is children are being told that these are no different, everything is all the same, and everything is being given an equal value. So children are not being taught to tolerate difference, they're just having their idea of normal extended, whereas the really valuable thing is to teach children to tolerate difference. And this isn't what the courses are doing, but let me get back to my main topic, which is focusing on the impact of LGBT ideology on the way that we understand relationships. So I think that how we understand family is being transformed, and how we understand mother and father. But what's also happening is that so we've not just had marriage and sex separated, and parenthood and procreation separated. We've also had sex and reproduction separated from each other. And I think this is also really important, because where sex has an association with a capacity to bring forth new life, this elevates it enormously. Whether, and again, even if I'm talking at a symbolic level, if you think of sex as something through which human beings are created, it really makes it something sort of, you know, it's our connection with divinity. You know, we can bring forth new life. It's something magical. But if you look at what's happening when children are taught about sex and relationships, reproduction is being absolutely driven out of it, and children are being discouraged from thinking about the reproductive aspects of sex. So again, I'm just going to read. Actually, no, I've got them in this book here. I'm going to read to you from this book. This book I'm doing has some great advertising out. Great Relationships and Sex Education. Alice Hoyle is the Sex Education Forum. Esther McGeaney is from Brooks. So this is a really mainstream book. So I think what we learn in this book does help us to know what our children will be taught, because these are from mainstream providers. And so what she tells us, too often RSE programs focus on the reproductive function of the body, which leads to a heteronormative view of sex and a focus on the genitals. You can avoid this by making sure that you start, and on it goes and explains you should focus on pleasure, and that way it takes away the focus from reproduction. There's another quote here. Emphasize that pleasure is a whole body experience that can involve all our senses, whether we're experiencing pleasure through exercise, food, intimacy, playing music, or having sex. By the way, that was for 13-year-olds. But what happens is that if you want to separate sex, what they're doing is discouraging the association between sex and reproduction, and that happens throughout that book. And they're instead, in its place, they're seeing sex as the purpose of sex is pleasure, and that is emphasised throughout the materials, course units on pleasure. And I've been at webinars where I've heard teachers talking about how do we teach children about pleasure. But I think the trouble is that if we see sex in terms of pleasure, our body becomes a tool which we use to achieve pleasure. And then if it's not just our body, then the body of our loved one also becomes a tool. And it's like, in this way, I think that it's kind of like the commodification of our relationships. Sex becomes something which we do in order to achieve pleasure. We're just using things, using our bodies for that end. And I think that, I don't think that enriches or enhances an understanding of sex. I think it's leading to a commodification, and it's quite interesting, because if you look at all these materials, which I did in the first video, I mean, they introduce young people to sort of, do you want to use the word imaginative or extreme? I don't know, but they encourage using sex toys, and they encourage all kinds of sexual practices. And I can't help, when I see this material, to think that these are people who actually don't know much about sexual pleasure and are just seeking more and more extreme experiences to compensate for it. That's what it looks like to me. But there are other things which go on, and that is that there are two other things. One is they constantly, even from the ages of 5, they're always talking about body parts. And I think that part of the reason they talk about body parts is because if we see ourselves as a whole, then we see ourselves as male and female. Our body is part of who we are. Whereas if you separate people into parts, then it kind of fragments that personhood. So there's this huge focus on body parts and on genitals, and they're all kinds of, they show children, like Brooke, for example, has one activity where this is not, I don't think they get the children to do this, but they have a video of it where women are given little cubicles and paint and mirrors, and they go and into a cubicle and they do a painting of their vagina. And then there are all other kinds of, there's a sort of obsessive focus on genitals. But the other thing which happens is there's a real determination to eliminate any differences between heterosexual and homosexual sex, of course, all in the name of, getting rid of stigma. And I'm just going to read some quotes to you. The key learning here is that it doesn't make sense to talk about gay sex or straight sex, as there are many different ways that two bodies come together to have sex. It may involve mutual masturbation, oral sex, penetrative sex, using sex toy, etc., etc. And then here it says, there are some sexual activities that may require a particular anatomy, e.g. penis and vagina sex, although if this is reframed as penetrative sex, then anyone can engage in this activity if they have a sex toy or penis. And this is what we find, is that there's a really increased focus on anal sex. And this is because if we make anal sex seem completely normal, then gay people, there'll be no stigma associated with gay sex. So for example, Brooke, in their pleasure module, and I did read you this in my first video, but for those of you who didn't see it. So Brooke, in their pleasure module, they have a very brief description of the vagina, and then they have a very, very lengthy description of the anus. The anus is the external opening of the rectum. The rectum is the muscular tube that leads from the colon to the anus. The rectum is rich in nerve endings, meaning it can be pleasurable to stimulate. Before trying anal penetration, it can be a good idea to try gently caressing the anus and or inserting a finger into the anus. You could also try caressing the anus with your tongue. This will help you to find out if anal sex is something you might enjoy, and they go on. It has two sphincters. The inner one reacts to pressure and tells you when to poo. And then it tells you, because the sphincters are designed to hold poo in, it can take some practice to relax sufficiently to allow penetration. Starting with a finger or a small sex toy can be a good start. The movement of anal sex can be especially pleasurable for the person giving anal sex because the movement provides stimulation to the penis, and many men find they reach orgasm through anal sex, etc., etc. And another activity is the dice game, where children are given, I think it's children from either 13 or 14 years old upwards, and they're given two dice with the words, they have the words, I think it's vagina, penis, anus, object, mouth, something else, and they shake the dice, and then there's a whole combination of activities. And the whole idea, when you see this exercise, the whole idea is to create lots of activities which you can do just as much if you're two gay, if you're two men or two women together. It's kind of just they're really trying to move away from the whole idea of reproductive sex. And in fact, in this book, she always refers to, if she's talking about regular sex, she always says, you know, penis and vagina sex, just to make it clear that that's one option of many. And also in this book, they put STDs, pregnancy, as if pregnancy is another form of STD. So what we've got happening is, I think it's really teaching our children a very distorted and unhealthy understanding of sex in this process of trying to allegedly sort of destigmatize LGBT relationships. And so this is really what I'm trying to drive at, is that there is an ideology going on here which is transforming the most sacred and private areas of our life, you know, family, sex, marriage, parenting. It's transforming these, and it's doing so without our consent, and in a way which I think very many people are not aware of, particularly because it's happening directly to our children. So parents aren't, the material's not being channeled necessarily through parents, so we're not so aware of what's happening. And what I want to say is that this transformation has been, there is a specific agenda behind this. And for example, there was a book written in 1989 called After the Ball by Kirk and Madsen, and they actually, I'm just going to find the quote, and they actually say, they say that we are safest in the long run if we can actually make them like us. Conversion aims at just this. We mean conversion of the average American's emotions, mind and will through a planned psychological attack in the form of propaganda fed to the nation via the media. So this was a propaganda book, After the Ball, and it was very widely circulated. It's a very well-known book, and you can read about it online. It's difficult to buy because it now costs £1,000. But this idea that we should become like gay people is really pervasive. So, for example, Peter Tatchell, when gay marriage was being introduced, Peter Tatchell points out, he says, well, it's not equal because marriage and... Well, let me read it to you. Okay, let me read it to you. That'll be easier. So, the existing grounds for the annulment of a marriage, non-consummation and adultery do not apply in the case of same-sex marriages. To many people, these are antiquated aspects of marriage law that should be repealed. Nevertheless, this differential in the law governing same-sex and opposite-sex married couples is not equality. So what Peter Tatchell is saying there is that he wants our relationships to become like gay relationships. You know, and not involve consummation and not involve monogamy. And there are many other quotes like this. I'll just read some of them to you because it's important that we know this. So this is Paula Ettelbrick. She was. This was a few years ago. Being queer means pushing the parameters of sex, sexuality and family, and in the process transforming the very fabric of our society. We must keep our eyes on the goals of providing true alternatives to marriage and of radically reordering society's views of the family. And this is completely written into the agenda. I mean, this book by Ellie Barnes and Anna Carlisle, they talk in this book, their words are they want to smash heteronormativity. So these transformations I'm talking about are not accidental. This is what they want to do and they see as acceptable. The Gay Liberation Manifesto likewise explained how its long-term goal was to rid society of the gender role system which is at the root of our oppression. This can only be achieved by the abolition of the family unit. Children must be liberated from the present condition of having their role in life defined by biological accident. And if you look at the No Outsiders, I'll put some, if you look at No Outsiders, this was full of quotes. I'll read one, I might as well. Another one. So she says, this is what one teacher says: "I'm really concerned about the ways I find myself latching on to the safe images of gay daddies and lesbian mummies, or at least gay and lesbian couples falling in love. I guess I'm partly led to this safe middle road placed by the project books which inscribe these notions of romantic monogamous relationships. However, this essentialism, however strategic, runs the risk of reifying the categories that the queer project seeks to disrupt, reinforcing, for example, the perceived superiority of a particular type of monogamous, child-centered family relationship embodied by the penguins." And then we've also got Eric Anderson. He wrote a book where he hugely critiques monogamy, and he appeared on Breakfast TV.
This isn't to say that men were designed to cheat. This is to say that monogamy was never designed to be good for human beings. We don't fit well with monogamy.
He is, and he never at any point mentions that he is a gay man. He's gay man and has children through this gay relationship somehow or another. I'm not sure how, but anyway. So again, we've got a gay man telling us heterosexual people how we should conduct our lives, and so I just think we need to be aware of this and think about if it's what we really want. And I think if you look at the materials, I think it's actually very damaging for our children and for our society, and I think that it's certainly not something that I want, and I'm just trying to raise your awareness about what's happening. So, thank you.